What's up guys, my name is Ace, and I hope you guys all had an excellent Christmas, and one thing that I really like doing this time of the year is making a beginner tips video for all of those people that may have just gotten the game for Christmas, or for people that have had the game for a while, but they're still looking for some relatively basic tips to help them improve. Now these tips are going to be in no particular order, and they're kind of all over the place. Some of them are like class setup related tips, other ones are gameplay related tips, and then there's others that are just tips that will apply to basically any first-person shooter game. So let's start it off talking about some of the guns that I would recommend using as a beginner player. So with this, I'm thinking of guns that are first up unlocked fairly early on in the game, so you don't have to spend a ton of time to get to them. And then second, the big thing I'm looking for here is just ease of use and how forgiving the gun is for somebody that might not be too experienced. These aren't necessarily the most powerful guns in all situations. They're just the sort of guns that are easy to handle, easy to control, and good in a wide variety of situations. And the first one I've got for you on my list here is the AK-47. This assault rifle is probably the most versatile gun in the entire game. It's got very little recoil, so it's very easy to control. It's got a super consistent 4-shot kill. It's one of the few guns where headshots aren't really going to be helping you, but they aren't really required to get a really fast time to kill either. So it kills very quickly with just body shots alone, and the handling is pretty decent on it as well. So overall, I do feel like the AK-47 is probably the best beginner gun in the entire game. However, a couple others that I'd recommend for people that want to be maybe a bit more aggressive would be either the AK-74U or the MP5. These two SMGs are also very solid choices. They kill very quickly, they don't have a ton of recoil for an SMG at least, and they're both just really easy to use, I've found. So yeah, as a beginner at least, those are the three guns that I would be looking toward, at least at the beginning, just to get you started and get you off on the right track, and then afterwards, once you become more comfortable with the game, you can branch out to other weapons. And speaking of starting off with these weapons, a big thing with Black Ops Cold War is attachments are very powerful in this game, and they often are what make a gun good. The difference between a gun with no attachments and a gun with 5 attachments on is massive in this game, and this means when you're first starting off and trying out a new gun for the first time from level 1 with no attachments, you're generally going to have a very hard time with that gun. So the next tip that I've got for you guys, if you don't want to go through that initial struggle in multiplayer with a weapon with no attachments, what I really like to do is go into the zombies mode and level up my first, 10 levels or so just playing zombies. When you're playing zombies, it's a super relaxed sort of experience. You're just shooting AI bots. You don't have to worry about competing against other players that are potentially really good. And this allows you to blast through those early levels fairly quickly and without really any stress as well. It's a really relaxed way of getting those initial attachments, so then when you go back over to multiplayer, you've at least got a good handful of attachments that will make your gun decent, and therefore you'll be that much more competitive against other players. Moving on to the next tip that I've got for you guys, still focusing on things outside of the gameplay at this point. When you are creating a class setup and you're adding attachments to your gun, this is the first time in Call of Duty history where we can see really detailed stats on the weapon and how each attachment is going to be changing those stats. So for those that haven't seen this yet, when you're hovering on one of the non-optic attachments, at least on console or if you're using a controller, you press R2 and this brings up your advanced stats. And from here, you can see all of the specific stats like the amount of damage that you're dealing, keeping in mind that enemy players have 150 health in this game. And then you can see other things like the exact rate of fire values. You can see your aim down sight time, your sprint out time, your bullet velocity. You can see all of those stats. And then as you stack attachments on, just pay attention to those numbers. And this allows you to really tailor that class setup to exactly what works for you and your playstyle. If you want a gun that's really snappy with aim down sight time, then you can really focus on that number. But watch the other numbers as well to make sure you're not sacrificing too much in another area. This is a really nice feature because it means that you can actually see what's going on and make good decisions for yourself when making a class setup rather than having to go to YouTube videos and just copy what YouTubers are using. You can see exactly what's changing for yourself. Next up, just another note on class setups, but this also applies to gameplay as well. In my opinion, the most valuable perk in the entire game at the moment is Ninja. This is the one that makes your footsteps almost completely silent. There's still technically a little bit of noise that your footsteps make, but in most situations, if you're using Ninja, the enemy will not be hearing your footsteps. And this is really important because without Ninja, the footsteps are actually very loud in Black Ops Cold War. At least in the game's current state, they're still very loud. And this means if you come up against anybody with any sort of competence and a headset, they're going to be hearing you approach from a mile away, and therefore they're going to be ready for you, and you'll basically never be getting the jump on somebody if you're moving. Now, I do realize Ninja's unlocked a bit later on in the leveling, so it is something you sort of have to work toward. But just keep that in mind and keep that as a goal. Once you get Ninja unlocked, it's a big game changer, especially for people that like to be aggressive. Next up, something that's fairly unique to Black Ops Cold War in relation to many of the more recent Call of Duty titles is headshots are very useful on most guns in this game. Like I said earlier, the AK-47 is kind of an exception to this. You just want to go for body shots with the AK-47. But for most other guns in the game, it's only going to take you 1 or 2 headshots mixed in with body shots in order for you to reduce the number of shots it takes to kill. And to top this off and make headshots even more effective, there is basically no actual flinch in this game when you get shot by an enemy player. Whereas in every other Call of Duty game that's ever been made, if you get shot while aiming at somebody, your point of aim is going to be kicked up above their head if you're aiming at their head. So therefore, in the past, headshots were more of a risky thing to be doing. If you aim for the head and then get flinched above them, you're going to miss all of your shots and get killed. Whereas in Black Ops Cold War, your point of aim will not be moving, and therefore it's much more beneficial in this game to be aiming for the head than in any previous Call of Duty game that has ever existed. Another reason for this is the time to kill is a little bit slower in this game compared to other COD games, so it's generally going to take you 1 extra shot to kill than what we're normally used to in Call of Duty. So anything you can do to reduce those number of shots to kill is going to make a big difference here. Next up, let's get into a gameplay-specific tip, and this is one of those tips that applies to basically any first-person shooter out there, but it's still one of the most common mistakes that I see beginners making, and this mistake is poor centering. And what I mean by centering is always trying to keep the center of your screen up and in a position where you expect to potentially be running into an enemy player. So if you're approaching a corner, for instance, instead of having the center of your screen aiming low, which is a habit that a lot of beginner players get into, instead of aiming at the ground in front of you, you want to keep that sight up toward like torso level where you'd expect an enemy to be. And also, you don't want to be aiming at a wall, for instance, next to the position where an enemy might be coming around a corner. You want to be aiming directly at that point where an enemy may end up appearing. And the reason for this is pretty obvious. If an enemy does end up appearing where you expect them to be appearing there, and you're centered properly, all you have to do is aim down sight and fire your gun. Whereas if you weren't centering properly, you have to make an adjustment, then aim down sight, then start firing your gun. And the amount of time that it takes you to make that initial adjustment to get on target is often what makes the difference between winning or losing that gunfight. So as you're moving around the map, always be aware of exactly where the center of your screen is and try to put it in a place where you most expect an enemy to be coming from. And going off of that, getting into my next tip, you might have seen that I mentioned as you move around the map. This is my next suggestion. Make sure you are moving around the map. I know that as a beginner player, it can be really intimidating to be moving around, and it's much more attractive to just find a nice position that you can easily control and let the enemy players come to you. Instead, as a beginner, I highly encourage you to actively move around the map. I don't mean to just blindly run around like a chicken with your head cut off or anything. You can still approach things carefully and take your time as you move around the map. But the more you move around the map, the wider variety of situations you're going to be putting yourself into, and therefore the faster you're going to be learning and the more you'll be improving as a player. For the people that just sit in one area of the map and they get really good at controlling that one exact area of a map, they might end up with a better score at the end of the game than you, but they're not going to be improving as a player nearly as much, and in the long run, it's just going to be holding them back. So if you're really looking to improve as a player, put yourself out there, try to put yourself in a wide variety of situations, so then you can learn what works, and more importantly, what doesn't work. And this flows nicely into the next tip that I've got for you guys, and this is always try to learn from your mistakes. This applies to basically everything in life, but it also applies to video games. When you're playing, don't just shut off your brain and not think about what's going on. Instead, anytime you die, for instance, take a step back, have a look at that situation, and think about what went wrong. What could you have done differently? Was your positioning really bad? Should you have not been in that spot in the first place, and would you have been better off in a different spot? Or was your aim bad, for instance, and could you be working on that and thinking about your aim a little bit more? Basically, just always try to find out what went wrong and what you could do differently the next time you run into a similar situation. Next up on my list here, actively work on your aim. And in order to do this, I actually have an aiming drill for you, which you can do in Black Ops Cold War when you hop into a custom game. You'll just be shooting bots, but this is a really good way to accelerate the process of improving your aim and also just turning gunfights into muscle memory, so you don't even have to think about the gunfight part. And this frees up your brain to be thinking about the bigger picture of the match, which is a much more advanced skill set. So the faster you get those basics down of winning gunfights and having decent aim, the faster you're able to move on to the more advanced tactics. So I am just going to leave my aiming drill linked in the description down below, and I highly encourage you to check that out after you're done watching this video, because it absolutely will accelerate the process of you getting better aim over time. Speaking of aim, there is one really important setting in Cold War that I highly recommend anybody with a controller change. This doesn't really apply to mouse and keyboard users. And this setting is your dead zone setting, because the default dead zone setting is set fairly high, and what this means is the aiming by default probably isn't going to feel as responsive as it should be. Now, in-game, they don't actually label it as dead zone. What you're looking for is in the controller tab of your settings, scroll down to the minimum input threshold for your left and your right stick. Like I said, by default, this should be set at 10. And what you want to do is lower this value as low as it will possibly go without your aim moving by itself when you set your controller down. So it's best to hop into a custom game here so you can test this for yourself. Drop this value as low as possible, then set your controller down while you're in a game, and just see if your aim moves by itself at all. If it does, this is called stick drift, and you will have to increase your dead zone setting a little bit, because this is what the dead zone setting is for, is to eliminate that stick drift. But basically, you just want to get this value as low as possible without experiencing that stick drift. This will make sure that your aim is as responsive as possible. And this is a very common issue that people were getting into when they first got the game, is it felt like the aim just wasn't very responsive, and a lot of that was down to the dead zone setting. But finally, I've got one last tip that I'm going to be sharing for you guys that is specific to Black Ops Cold War, and it's very different this time around. This is their score streak system. Now, for those that are familiar with Call of Duty, we've always had either kill streaks or score streaks, and with these, you have to chain kills and or score together in a single life in order to earn your streaks, and then you can use those streaks like UAVs or napalm strikes, for instance. However, in Black Ops Cold War, they have completely revamped this system where your streak progress doesn't reset when you die. However, it's going to take you way more score than it would in previous Call of Duty games. And also, most of your score is going to be coming from when you go on a higher kill streak within the same life. So if you are trying to earn these streaks more effectively, you still have to be chaining multiple kills together without dying. And just an example of this, you get about 10 times the amount of score for your 5th kill in the same life than you do for your 1st kill. Now, unfortunately, this means in objective game modes, it's often in your best interest to not play the objective. And to be clear, I don't like this system, I don't support this system, but I'm giving tips on how to improve, and this is what the game actively incentivizes, and I want to let you guys know that that's the case. If you're trying to get your streaks up as effectively as possible, you still have to be chaining multiple kills together within the same life. So just because you don't lose all of your progress toward your streaks every time you die, it's still in your best interest to stay alive for as long as possible and get as many kills together within the same life. And with that, that's going to wrap it up for today's video. On the top 10 or so beginner tips, I may have thrown a couple more in there for Black Ops Cold War. Hopefully these tips will help get you started and get you off on the right foot as you get into this game. And this is where I just want to give you a quick reminder that I have my aiming drill linked in the description down below, and I highly encourage you to check it out if you're looking to improve as fast as possible in this game. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.